In this lecture, we're looking at Calvin as a humanist. And we can begin by remembering where we've come to so far in the lectures. In our last lecture, we looked at Calvin's birth and the limited amount of information that we're aware of his youth in the area of Noyon, as well as his traveling to Paris, his enrolling in the Collège de la Marque, where he learned his Latin and his rhetoric from a wonderful teacher named Cordier. And then he moved to the Collège de Montaigu, and we said that at some point along the way, either Calvin's father or Calvin himself, or more likely both, became convinced that the study of philosophy and eventually theology was not really the path for Calvin long term. And so Calvin moved from the study of philosophy and eventually theology to the study of law at the University of Orléans. Now again, we've said before that we're trying to figure out what is going on here. And it's not simply historical curiosity that has us raise this question, because it just stands to reason that if Calvin later becomes a Protestant, if he later rejects the church, and yet here, at a relatively young age, frankly about a decade before his conversion really takes shape, if Calvin is being directed away from theology by his father, and he's being directed towards subjects that are not conducive necessarily to a lifelong engagement or career in the church, well, then historians are usually in the right for asking the question, is there some crack in the armor at this early stage? And the answer is we really won't know. The two biographies that we've mentioned of Calvin's life give us two separate answers. In fact, they give us three separate answers, because Beza gives us two different answers in two of the different editions of his life of Calvin. Beza says in his first edition that Calvin transferred out of reverence for his father. That is to say, his father desired that Calvin would go on to study law, and Calvin is a dutiful son, and this is what he does. Culloden takes a more ethical tone. He argues that Calvin, in a very short period of time, had already come to the conclusion that theology within the Catholic Church was corrupt, and therefore he jumped to the study of law. Beza then writes another edition of his life of Calvin, greatly expanded and nuanced, and in this one he argues simply that Calvin and his father changed their mind, that a life of theology, of service in the church of a number of different varieties, was not the path for him, and so instead he chose the study of law. And there's really just not a lot of evidence here to make a firm conclusion. Later in his life, Calvin will actually say that his father felt that the path of law was more lucrative. He says this in the 1550s, which is only a number of years before Calvin himself dies. There doesn't seem to be, though, significant evidence that what's going on here is a fundamental anxiety or a fundamental rejection of the church. It's a logical leap, in other words, to say that a father and a son, or both in tandem, chose a different path away from the church and towards the humanist study of the law, to leap from that to the idea that there is some sort of fundamental problem with the church that Calvin and his father are already experiencing, that somehow preconditioned Calvin to the Reformation, is really a bit of a stretch. Even Culloden's argument really seems to smack of hagiography, the idea that Calvin, at a very young age, is just a schoolboy, and frankly, before he's even really studied theology in-depthly, has somehow sniffed him out as being all corrupt, is frankly reading the later Calvin back into his early days, and that's the epitome of bad history. But we do need to explore some of this because I think what's going on here often, particularly at the student level when they first encounter this reality, that Calvin moves from the study of philosophy and theology to the study of law, that they see in this, frankly, the more modern reality that Calvin seemingly transfers from seminary to law school, and it conjures up this really harsh distinction between studying things of God and pursuing financial lucrative prospects that are entirely secular in nature. Now, this is not true in Calvin's case for two basic reasons. First of all, by and large, pursuing a life in the church was lucrative. It had plenty of prospects. The church was wealthy. The church had lots of opportunities for patronage. Pursuing theology, outside of monasticism in particular, was a perfectly legitimate way of engaging the church and having a lucrative career. So when we hear in the record that Calvin's father might have demurred about the prospects of church life as being lucrative, it might very well be that Calvin's father sensed that there were fewer options within the church, and that there were more options in the study of law. So that's the first. Calvin is not abandoning a life of poverty or a life of ministry for ill-gotten gain, per se. The second problem is that the study of law in this day is really not like the study of law in our modern world. It has some analogies to be sure, but the study of law in a world that is still relatively united in terms of the sword of the state and the sword of the church was in some ways, at least according to the modern mind, really engaging with the higher level of society from just the other direction. Again, we've already seen this in Luther's life. The relationship between church and state was one that was entangled. Lawyers were very much part and parcel of the life of medieval Christendom. And though they might be engaging the world from the political arm of the world, that is not to be interpreted as some sort of secular ill-gotten gain that is antithetical or relatively opposed to the life of the church. And more importantly, as we're going to see in this lecture and in our next lecture, the study of law throughout France at this time was one of the principal avenues for the study of humanism. And some of the more principal theologians and exegetes and Protestants as well as Catholics that come from France in the 16th century come out of this world of the study of law. And as we'll see in these lectures, this one and in our next lecture on Calvin and French humanism, what we'll see is that Calvin comes from a very specific context of the humanist method and of the study of text and the classics, and in particular of scriptural reasoning. In fact, in many ways, the study of law is really more just another way of attacking the classics. And that is because the study of law itself comes from the Roman judicial laws and the study of the classic past as the foundations of the modern legal system in Calvin's day. And so someone transferring to the subject of law knew that they were transferring to a different domain and to a different set of organizing principles per se, but they would not have interpreted this as a fundamental rejection of the Catholic Church itself. In fact, one of Calvin's most important teachers at the University of Orléans was a man who was married. He was a secular professor type, but when his wife died, he actually took holy orders and he became vicar general of an established order and became instrumental in the church's prosecution and enforcement of traditional religion, of medieval Catholicism, in particular in Paris at the Sorbonne in the 1530s, which is the very thing that caused Calvin to flee and to land in Geneva, down in the Swiss cantons. So the way you have to see this is that law and theology, church and state, are permeable worlds. They're not antithetical. It's not sacred secular in the modern sense of those words. Rather, it is two ways to serve God and two potentially lucrative paths. And what seems to be happening here is Calvin and his father, or perhaps just Calvin's father, and Calvin is a dutiful son and obeys. Calvin is sent to Orléans to study law. Now, one of the missing links for understanding Calvin in this day and age, and for understanding Calvin's context, is the man Pierre-Robert Olivétan. Now, his actual name is Pierre-Robert, but he went in his day by the name Olivétan or Olivetanus in the Latin. Now, why is Olivétan the missing link? Well, too often the way the biography of Calvin reads is you have this plucky little student, this law student, who embraces the Reformation, who is then run out of the city of Paris, and he arrives in Geneva shortly after having published the 1536 edition of the Institutes, which is a very short book at the time. And according to so many biographies, William Farel, who's the man who convinces Calvin to stay in Geneva, and a number of others have just simply been stunned by the staggering genius of Calvin, this man who just sort of enters stage left, and the rest of the Protestant world says, thank you. Now, I'm not trying to diminish Calvin's importance, but in his early days, Calvin was the younger brother. He was the younger figure on the scene. So how then did William Farel hear of Calvin? And how did Calvin get plugged into the Swiss Reform movement? Another way of asking the question is, why in the world did Calvin flee to Switzerland? He could have fled home, for example. He wasn't the primary focus of any significant inquisition as to his theology, at least not to the sense that he would be chased down. Well, the answer, again, the missing link, is Pierre-Robert, or Pierre-Robert Olivétan. You see, because Pierre was actually Calvin's cousin. Pierre was born in the same city. They grew up together. Pierre was born in 1506, which means that he is 3 years older than Calvin and functions a bit like an older brother. Pierre also traveled with Calvin to study, first in Paris and then later at Orléans. So the two are vitally connected in this reform movement. And the reason this is important is because Olivétan actually very quickly in the 1530s becomes instrumental in the Swiss reform movement down there in the Alpine regions, as well as in northern Italy. We know that by the mid-1530s, in fact, Olivétan had become pretty enamored with the teachings of Zwingli, who, as we saw in our previous lectures, was, in many ways, the real founder of the initial Reformed movement within the church. Now, the problem here, of course, is we don't really know what Olivétan's influence was on Calvin. We do know that it was personal. He's a family member, and it is certainly the case that the two become pretty enamored with the Reformed movement. The problem, though, is we're not sure where Olivétan stands in the 1520s, during their time in Orléans and during the time of Calvin's legal studies. But it is certainly tantalizing to assume, and it's probably fair game to assume on pretty solid ground, that Olivétan and Calvin are engaging in reading some of these texts, because eventually Olivétan makes a beeline for the Swiss regions and becomes engaged and involved with Farel and the Swiss reform movement years before Calvin comes on the scene. So, for example, in 1532, William Farel and Olivétan take part in the Chanforan synod, and this is a vital synod. Chanforan is in the area of the modern-day city of Angronia, which, if you follow the boot up, let's just say it's above the knee. It's all the way in the northern part of modern-day Italy. It's really at that border between Italy and the Swiss regions. And Angronia is the location where you have this important synod in 1532, the Chanforan synod, which is often called the Waldensian synod. And this is because a group known as the Waldensians, who had been attacked by the medieval church and actually assaulted by papal armies as heretics and opposers of the Catholic Church, had essentially holed themselves up in these areas of southern Switzerland or northern Italy in the Alpine regions. And so, at the city of Angronia, representatives of the Waldensians from Calabria and Apulia, as well as other areas, had come together and with the help of William Farel and Olivétan, had embraced and come over to the Protestant faith. Not only that, but the synod actually released 500 crowns, which is an extraordinarily large sum of money, for Olivétan to spend as much time as he can and as much energy as he can translating the Bible from the Greek and the Hebrew into the French. And this will culminate eventually in what we today call the Olivétan Bible, which is the first French translation of the Bible from this century. So is it any wonder then, Calvin's cousin, involved in the Waldensian turnover into the Protestant faith, and himself very instrumental in the translation of the Bible into French, just a couple of years before Calvin happens to bump into William Farel, is somehow attracted to the Swiss regions and the reform movement down there. Now, Calvin is his own man, and he never gives us much of a cause or a case for believing that Olivétan is the one who led him to the faith. But there is this familial connection, and it is very powerful. And this is certainly why Farel is so keen to have Calvin stay in Geneva with him to effect the Reformation there. And we'll look at that story in a later lecture. Now, just what the intellectual context of Olivétan is and the world that Calvin is engaging in, we're going to look at in our next lecture in terms of the ideas involved. But we can say something about the context, at least now. Calvin moves to the city of Orléans, and he's there for a brief period of time. And it's there in the study of law that Calvin finds his tribe. He finds like-minded people of his own age with whom he can study law, and he can really engage deeply in the method of exploring the past, both in terms of history and grammar and rhetoric. It's in early 1528, in fact, when Calvin arrives at Orléans. And while he's there, he begins to do things that are really symptomatic of where Calvin's going in terms of his intellectual development. He starts to take on the study of Greek, for example. Now, it takes him some time before he becomes really strong in this language. and he will become quite extraordinarily good at his Greek. But he begins it here in 1528, and at Orleans, Calvin is exposed to what we might call traditional medieval scholastic method when it comes to the study of law. He has a professor there who is profoundly committed to the traditional orders, to reading texts as wellsprings and resources for affirming traditional doctrines and traditional views of law and culture in the medieval world. Now, what that means is any number of different things. But obviously by 1528, the Reformation is in full bloom in Germany under Luther. And so part of what's in play here is that the traditional forces, the traditional perspective at the University of Orleans is being impressed upon Calvin as he is developing his study of law. In 1529, though, just a short time after, Calvin transfers to another French university, the University of Bourges. Now, at this university, which is frankly one of the most important law schools or universities for the study of law outside of Italy, so it is at the very top of the echelons of power and influence. Here, Calvin comes across a really kind of pugnacious, intriguing little fellow by the name of Andrea Alciati. And Alciati was an Italianman, and he was a legal professor. And he had come really under the influence of one of the nobility within the French crown, a woman by the name of Marguerite of Navarre. Now again, we're going to look at Marguerite more in our next lecture when we look at the overall context of French humanism. But needless to say, the University of Bourges, with Alciati and the influence of Marguerite of Navarre, was saturated with this humanist method and provided Calvin really an antithesis to the more traditional medieval scholastic method of the University of Orleans. And this is important, and this is why we're spending so much time on it. The tense relationship between scholastic method on the one hand and humanist method on the other was particularly pronounced in the country of France. And this pronounced fight was even more intensified at the level of the universities. And I'll explain why that is in our next lecture. But Calvin here, immediately, between 1528 and 1529, really on the eve, you might say, of his conversion to the Protestant perspective on the faith, is being put really on the horns of a dilemma to help determine where he is coming from ultimately in terms of his perspective on traditional scholastic categories and tools for engagement, and the newer French humanism, which had pervaded all types of things from the study of law to the study of theology to the study of the very classics themselves. And this tension within Calvin is important because it really is one of the more important reasons why Calvin becomes a Protestant. He is put very naturally between these two categories. In fact, he is put between these two categories in a way that Luther never was. Luther, as we saw, was always the scholastic man. And he embraces some of the humanist perspectives later after his excommunication, in particular the study of languages for translation of the scriptures. But Luther always remains something of a scholastic man. He was always a dialectician, always a man who was ready for an argument, but not necessarily ready for long historical grammatical exegesis of a text. He's more of a systematician, we might say, in our modern language, than a biblical theologian. Calvin, during his education between 1528 and 1530, is being put to the point. And we see this actually because in Calvin's first printed work, the first time he put his pen to paper and it came to print, Calvin is actually asked to somewhat referee this question. One of Calvin's old buddies from his days in Orleans and beyond was Nicholas Duchemin. And Duchemin had, just like Calvin, studied at the University of Orleans, and he had studied as well at the University of Bourges. Alciati was just that much of a lightning rod that a number of people went to study with him. And Duchemin, with Calvin, as well as some of their other buddies, had gone down to Bourges in order to study with Alciati. Well, Duchemin at this point, in 1530 and 31, had sat down to write a tract excoriating the methods and the haughtiness of Alciati. And the book would be published by the title The Antapologia, which in its longer title is that it is an anti-apology, or a critique, we might say in modern English, of the method and the style and the conclusions of Alciati. And Duchemin takes the more traditional scholastic opinion on things. And, reaching for his buddy, he asks Calvin to write the preface to this book. Well, the book is published on the 6th of March, 1531. And again, this is the first time Calvin's writing, the first time his own words are put in publication for print and purchase. And what's so important about Calvin's preface here is not that it really tells us much of where Calvin's going to go as a reformer, but it gives us a hint or a clue as to the context of the world that Calvin is living in. Because here his good friend Duchemin has taken sides. He has chosen the scholastic method, more of a systematic method, and he has rejected Alciati with his more humanist style. Well, Calvin in the preface, really not helping his friend out much at all, actually plays the referee. Calvin attempts to the best of his ability, and whether or not he achieves this is up to the reader. Calvin attempts to come to a conclusion that both can be within the limits of possibility in terms of the method of studying theology. But Calvin decides not to choose sides yet. And this is vital because in the context of the French humanist movement, there still was by this time in the 1530s a belief and a desire that the humanist method could live within the context of the Catholic Church and that it could reform it from within and it could challenge some of the problems that they felt were there in the Catholic Church, in particular related to theology. And Calvin here in 1531 is signaling that he believes that the humanist method has some things to say that are better critiques and better intellectual uses of text of the scriptures or of theology than where medieval scholasticism on its own had gone. And Calvin is leaning towards humanism, but he is not rejecting outright scholasticism. Now, that's not saying that humanism is Protestant or scholasticism is Catholic, but it does show that Calvin, within the context of the French Reform movement of the late 20s and early 1530s, is wrestling with and struggling with where good intellectual engagement with the scriptures in their originals can live within an increasingly hostile environment of the Parisian universities as they seek to reject everything that has to do with the Reform movement of Luther. By this point in the late 1520s, Luther has come out pretty boldly not only against the Catholic Church, but now also against Erasmus in 1525. And so increasingly, humanists in France like Calvin are being asked to choose and are being urged to figure out where they fit within this increasingly polarized spectrum between Protestantism on the one hand and its commitment to the scriptures in the originals, and the more traditional medieval scholastic approach of places like the University of Paris. And so important is this context and so important is this backdrop that we're actually going to spend our next lecture on that as we attempt to understand where Calvin is coming from even before he arrives in Geneva. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to be looking at Calvin and the context, the wider context of the French humanist movement.